The early 1800s in Alabama were years of both immense prosperity and immense cruelty. Cotton was called white gold, and it made plantation owners into some of the wealthiest men in the South. Among them was James Whitlock, a man whose wealth and arrogance became his identity. His plantation sprawled over hundreds of acres, dotted with rows of cotton that seemed endless to the eye. To outsiders, James was the picture of success: broad house, fine horses, a wife from a respectable family, and dozens of enslaved workers to keep the fields producing. But those who knew him closely, servants, workers, even his neighbors, saw a darker truth. James was not only proud of his wealth, but pride had become his prison. He measured everything, his land, his slaves, his wife, even his children, by the standards of ownership and control. To him, human beings were not souls but possessions, items to display or discard according to his mood. James came from a line of planters. His father, stern and unforgiving, drilled into him the idea that a man's worth was determined by the size of his land and the obedience of those under him. From a young age, James equated authority with domination. He believed kindness was weakness, and respect was something to be demanded, not earned. When he inherited the plantation, James doubled its size within a decade. He gained a reputation as a clever businessman, but also as a cruel master. His punishments for slaves who faltered in the fields were not just severe but theatrical. Whippings in front of others. Humiliation meant to strike fear deep into the hearts of men and women. Where other planters sometimes looked away or gave leniency, James made sure to be seen as firm. His pride fed on fear. James's wife, Margaret Whitlock, was a woman of gentle nature. She had married him young, charmed at first by his ambition and promises of a secure life. But with time, she discovered the coldness behind his charm. Margaret was not the slender Southern belle that society adored. She was fuller in figure, with a round face and soft features, while she had a kind heart and a natural warmth that drew children and servants alike. James saw only what society whispered, that she was not fitting for a man of his wealth. Instead of protecting her from cruel gossip, James joined in. He often made sly remarks at gatherings, mocking her weight or dismissing her opinions. In the privacy of their home, he rarely offered affection. To him, Margaret was another possession, one that had not lived up to his expectations, and when pride ruled a man, disappointment quickly turned into disdain. In the nearby town, James Whitlock was a man both respected and feared. He donated generously to the church, but looked down on the preacher. He hosted lavish dinners where he would display his wealth, imported wine, silver cutlery, and grand feasts, but treated his guests as competitors in a game of social dominance. Men who shook his hand left feeling belittled. Women who spoke to him noticed his wandering eye. Yet for all his outward confidence, James was restless. His pride never allowed him satisfaction. When he looked at his fields, he thought they should be bigger. When he looked at his house, he wanted it grander. When he looked at Margaret, he saw only flaws. His wealth was great, but his peace was small. What made James dangerous was not just his arrogance, but the way he wielded it. For him, life was a ladder, and he believed he was at the top. Anyone beneath him existed to remind him of his own power. That included the enslaved men and women who broke their backs in his fields, and even Margaret, who should have been his partner, but was treated more like furniture in his grand house. This pride led him to acts of casual cruelty. He would test his slaves by giving impossible tasks, then mock their failure. He would scold Margaret for eating too much, even in front of guests. He once told a neighbor, with a smirk, "A man must prove his greatness not by the love he receives, but by the fear he commands." That single sentence captured the heart of James Whitlock. Yet, what James did not realize was that pride is a fragile foundation. Wealth can be lost, land can be taken. Even fear wears down with time. Those who live on fear begin to seek courage, and those who are mocked begin to seek dignity elsewhere. James believed himself unshakable, but the cracks had already begun to form. Margaret, though quiet and obedient on the surface, carried a loneliness that grew each year. She longed to be seen as more than her weight, more than a possession. Among the enslaved, whispers grew of James's cruelty and of the quiet strength that still lived in their hearts despite his efforts to crush it. And then there was Samuel, the dwarf slave, whose sharp mind and unbroken spirit stood as a quiet challenge to everything James believed. Samuel was small in stature, but carried a dignity James could never understand. It was only a matter of time before their worlds collided in a way James could not control. Looking back, the story of James Whitlock is not just about one man's arrogance, but about the dangers of pride itself. When wealth blinds a man to compassion, he becomes poorer than the slaves he owns. When pride robs him of the ability to love, he becomes lonelier than the wife he mocks. And when fear is the only respect he knows, he stands on a foundation that will one day crumble. James Whitlock thought himself untouchable. He thought his wealth and pride would secure his place forever. But what happened next would shake the very pillars of his house, leaving him shocked to learn that power does not lie in domination but in dignity, respect, and love. Among the dozens of enslaved men and women who worked on James Whitlock's sprawling Alabama plantation, one stood out, not because he was physically strong or especially skilled in the fields, but because he was different. His name was Samuel, and he was a dwarf. Samuel had been sold to the Whitlock plantation when he was only a boy, no more than 9 or 10 years old. His short stature had made him a target for mockery even on the auction block. Buyers had laughed, some suggesting he would be good for nothing but amusement. James Whitlock had bought him cheaply, believing he could at least be put to work around the house or repairing tools. To James, Samuel was a curiosity, something less than a man, yet still a possession to command. But what no one had counted on was Samuel's mind. Unlike many who were forced into the cotton fields, Samuel's small frame spared him the back-breaking work of picking under the blazing sun. Instead, he was often assigned tasks around the workshop, fixing broken tools, sharpening blades, mending harnesses, and even repairing furniture. With every passing year, his hands grew more skilled. What James dismissed as odd jobs became essential work to keep the plantation running smoothly. But Samuel's real gift was not in his hands. It was in his intellect and resilience. He listened carefully, remembered details, and solved problems quickly. When a plow broke, Samuel could fix it in less time than the blacksmith. When a wheel came loose from a cart, Samuel could repair it so well it lasted longer than before. Slaves began to whisper that Samuel had a gift for seeing what others could not. In the evenings after the day's labor, Samuel would sit quietly among the others and tell stories. Not grand tales of kings and heroes, but simple ones. Stories about dignity, courage, and endurance. He would say, "They can chain our hands, but they cannot chain our thoughts. They can break our backs, but they cannot break the truth of who we are." For many enslaved workers, beaten down by James's cruelty, these words became a source of strength. James Whitlock, however, despised Samuel. Not because of his size, but because of his spirit. James was a man who thrived on fear. He wanted his slaves to cower, to tremble when he spoke. But Samuel never gave him the satisfaction. When James mocked him, calling him half a man or my little clown, Samuel did not lash out, but neither did he shrink in shame. He met James's eyes calmly, as if to say, "You may own my body, but not my dignity." That quiet defiance enraged James more than any rebellion could have. James often tried to humiliate him publicly, making him perform tasks before others or ridiculing his stature during gatherings. But the more James mocked, the more the enslaved admired Samuel. They saw in him a living example that dignity could survive even in chains. Margaret Whitlock, James's wife, was among those who noticed Samuel's quiet strength. Unlike her husband, she did not view Samuel with contempt. She saw how he encouraged the other slaves, how he treated even the youngest child with kindness, how he carried himself with a grace that belied his small body. At first, Margaret said little, afraid of James's temper. But as years passed, she began to admire Samuel. When a chair leg snapped, it was Samuel who repaired it so well it looked new. When the kitchen door creaked endlessly, it was Samuel who oiled it until it swung silently. And when James's insults grew unbearable, Margaret sometimes found Samuel's calm words of reassurance gave her the strength to endure. Among the enslaved community, Samuel became more than just a man, he became a symbol. His small body and large spirit reminded them that worth was not measured by size, skin, or status. Some began to secretly call him the Little Lion, because though he was small, he carried the heart of something much greater. Samuel never openly defied James. He knew the price of rebellion was death, but he resisted in small, subtle ways. He fixed tools so they lasted longer, saving his fellow slaves from punishment when something broke. He shared wisdom, reminding them that life was more than the cotton fields. And most importantly, he refused to let James strip away his humanity. For James, Samuel was a constant irritation. On one hand, the dwarf slave was too useful to discard. On the other, his presence was a reminder that James could not control everything. Fear worked on most slaves, but not on Samuel. And now, even Margaret seemed to look at Samuel with a kind of quiet respect James himself had never earned. Pride made James blind but not stupid. He began to sense that Samuel's influence could become dangerous. Yet, the more James sought to humiliate him, the more Samuel's dignity shone. In trying to break him, James only revealed his own weakness. Samuel's story is not one of outward triumph. He did not overthrow his master, nor did he escape to freedom. Instead, his victory was internal. In a world built to strip him of humanity, Samuel held on to his dignity. He proved every day that a man's worth is not in his size, nor in his station, but in his spirit. For Margaret, his presence became a lifeline. For the enslaved, his words became a source of hope. And for James, though he never admitted it, Samuel was a thorn in his pride, an unspoken reminder that wealth and cruelty could not conquer the human spirit. In the years to come, it would be Samuel who played a role in turning humiliation into strength and cruelty into a lesson. James Whitlock had tried to make Samuel into an object of scorn, but instead Samuel became the very thing James could never be: a man respected for his courage, not feared for his power. The summer of 1834 had been harsh. Alabama's fields baked under relentless sun, and tempers in the Whitlock household flared with the heat. James Whitlock, proud planter and self-proclaimed master of everything around him, grew increasingly restless. Cotton prices were high, and his wealth grew by the week, but inside his heart, he felt only irritation. Wealth alone no longer satisfied him. He craved entertainment, domination, and reminders that he was above everyone else. It was during one of his notorious dinner gatherings that James's arrogance led him into a decision that would shock his household for years to come. On that evening, James filled his grand dining hall with neighbors, overseers, and wealthy acquaintances. The air smelled of tobacco and roasted meat, and the table glittered with polished silverware that James had insisted be shined twice over. He enjoyed such displays, not only for the food and drink but for the opportunity to flaunt his dominance over his wife and his slaves. Margaret, dressed in her best silk gown, sat quietly at the far end of the table. Her cheeks flushed from the wine, though not from joy. She knew these evenings well: laughter at others' expense, stories exaggerated by James until they were nearly lies, and subtle humiliations thrown her way in front of the guests. Tonight would be no different. As the meal progressed, James grew bolder. He mocked one neighbor for losing money in a gamble, ridiculed another for letting his horses run wild, and then, inevitably, turned his sharp tongue toward his own wife. "Look at her," James said loudly, tapping his glass for attention. "I married a woman with a noble family name, and what did I get? A cow fit for the dairy more than the drawing room." Laughter erupted, though some guests forced their smiles, embarrassed by the cruelty. Margaret lowered her eyes, tears threatening to form. She had endured years of these public insults, each one cutting deeper than the last. She sat still, her fork trembling in her hand. But James was not finished. He thrived on humiliation, the way others might thrive on applause, and he wanted this night to end with a spectacle. His eyes shifted to the corner of the room, where Samuel, the dwarf slave, stood quietly. Samuel had been ordered to serve wine that evening. His small stature made him stand out, and James enjoyed using him as a target for ridicule in front of guests. "Why, even Samuel here," James sneered, pointing his glass toward the servant, "could find more use for my wife than I can. Perhaps I should give her to him. At least then, she'd have company as ridiculous as herself." A hush fell over the room, followed by nervous laughter. Some guests chuckled at the audacity of the remark, while others exchanged uneasy glances. It was one thing to mock a wife, another to drag a slave into the humiliation. But James, drunk with wine and pride, mistook the silence for encouragement. "Yes," he continued, standing now swaying slightly. "Let it be known that Margaret is of so little value to me. I might as well hand her over to my dwarf. Perhaps she'd even thank me for giving her someone who could tolerate her company." The laughter returned, sharper now, feeding James's intoxicated bravado. Margaret froze, her face pale. Samuel remained still, his calm eyes betraying neither anger nor fear, only the quiet dignity that James hated most. When the guests left and the house grew quiet, the weight of James's words lingered in the air like smoke. Margaret retreated to her chamber, her heart breaking. The insult was not just public, it was devastatingly personal. To be spoken of as worthless, as an object to be given away to a slave, was a humiliation deeper than any she had endured before. Yet, in the silence of her room, another feeling began to stir, not only sorrow but defiance. She thought of Samuel's eyes when James had mocked him, calm, steady, unbroken. He had not flinched, nor had he allowed James's cruelty to strip away his dignity. Margaret realized that Samuel had endured a lifetime of such humiliation, and yet he walked with quiet strength. If Samuel could carry himself with dignity in chains, could she not also find strength in her own heart, even in marriage to a cruel man? James, meanwhile, retired to his study, satisfied with himself. He saw no danger in his words. To him, Margaret was already defeated. Samuel was only a dwarf, and his guests would remember the evening as another display of his wit. Pride had blinded him so completely that he could not imagine the consequences of his reckless bet. But what James failed to see was that in trying to humiliate his wife and his slave, he had planted the seeds of a bond he could not control. By pushing them both into the same shadow of his cruelty, he unwittingly tied their fates together. The days that followed were tense. Margaret avoided James, finding reasons to be in other parts of the house. Samuel continued his duties quietly, repairing tools, serving when called, and offering small kindnesses to others who needed them. But between Margaret and Samuel, a silent understanding grew. She began to notice his words more, his calm presence, his refusal to be broken. It was not romance yet. It was something simpler, but perhaps more powerful: respect. And for a woman who had been mocked and belittled for years, the discovery that another human being, one whom society dismissed, saw her as more than a joke was the beginning of a transformation. James Whitlock had made a cruel bet that night, believing he was asserting power. Instead, he revealed his own weakness. For a man who thrived on fear, he had created something more dangerous than rebellion, a spark of dignity shared between two people he sought to humiliate. And once dignity is shared, it grows. What James thought was a moment of drunken entertainment would soon unravel the very foundations of his household. For in the bond between Margaret and Samuel lay the seeds of a lesson James had never learned: that power without respect is fragile, and cruelty without love is hollow. After James Whitlock's cruel outburst at the dinner table, life in the grand plantation house settled into an uneasy rhythm. Outwardly, little had changed. The cotton still needed harvesting, slaves still labored in the fields, and James still strutted about as though he were king of Alabama. But beneath the surface, something had shifted. Margaret Whitlock, humiliated before guests and mocked as less valuable than a slave, found herself drifting further from her husband. The sting of James's insult clung to her like a shadow, yet it also awakened something unexpected inside her, a quiet resolve. And strangely, it was Samuel, the dwarf slave her husband had used in his cruel bet, who became the source of that awakening. At first, the bond between Margaret and Samuel was nothing more than shared silence. Whenever James was away, Margaret would walk the grounds to escape the stifling walls of the house. She often passed by the workshop, where Samuel repaired tools or carved bits of wood. Unlike other slaves, he was not bent double in the cotton rows. His tasks were different, and his quiet presence gave Margaret an odd comfort. She began to linger, watching him work. He never spoke first. Samuel was careful, for he knew the dangers of drawing attention to himself around the mistress of the house. But Margaret, craving someone who would not ridicule her, began to speak. At first, It was small talk, comments about the weather, questions about the tools he repaired, even idle remarks about the house. Samuel listened politely, nodding when needed, but Margaret could sense something more in his silence. Not fear, not resentment, but patience. And slowly, she realized he was giving her something she had not received from anyone in years: his attention. One afternoon, after a particularly bitter quarrel with James, Margaret wandered to the workshop in tears. James had mocked her weight again, this time in front of the house servants, and she felt broken. She sat near the doorway, trying to compose herself, when Samuel quietly asked, "Why do you let his words cut so deep?" Startled, Margaret looked at him. It was the first time he had spoken to her beyond courtesy. "Because he's my husband," she replied softly, "and because perhaps he is right." Samuel put down the tool he was holding and met her eyes with a steady gaze. "A man's cruelty speaks more about him than it does about you. His words are his weakness, not your worth." Margaret's breath caught. No one, not her husband, not her family, not even her friends in town, had ever spoken to her with such honesty and compassion. For the first time, she felt seen. From that moment, their conversations deepened. Margaret discovered Samuel's sharp mind, his quiet humor, and his ability to find dignity in a world that offered him none. He spoke of survival, of keeping one's spirit alive even when the body was chained. "They own our labor," Samuel once said, "but they cannot own our thoughts. That is where freedom lies." Margaret held on to those words like a lifeline. In Samuel's perspective, she found courage to face her own humiliation. If a man who had suffered lashes, ridicule, and a lifetime of bondage could still believe in his worth, why should she, with all her comforts, surrender to despair? What began as sympathy grew into admiration, and what began as admiration slowly blossomed into something Margaret had never expected: trust. In the stillness of the plantation evenings, Margaret would sometimes bring Samuel small comforts: an extra piece of bread, a scrap of cloth, a book discarded in the house. She knew such gestures were risky, but she could not help herself. In return, Samuel offered her words, not gifts, wisdom, kindness, and the unshakable truth that dignity was a right, not a privilege. Other slaves noticed the quiet exchanges. Some whispered in awe, others in caution. It was dangerous for a mistress and a slave to be seen as anything but distant. Yet they also understood James had tried to humiliate them both, and in that shared wound, something unbreakable had formed. Margaret began to change. No longer did she shrink as much under James's insults. When he mocked her at supper, she replied calmly instead of with silence. When he belittled her in front of others, she held her head higher. She did not argue with him directly, but she refused to crumble. James noticed the difference, though he could not understand its cause. To him, Margaret had always been weak, dependent on his approval. Now, she carried herself with a quiet strength that unsettled him. He suspected nothing of Samuel, for he could not imagine that a dwarf slave, someone he considered beneath notice, could be the source of his wife's courage. But Margaret knew. Every glance she exchanged with Samuel, every conversation they shared, strengthened her spirit. She was no longer just James's wife, mocked and discarded. She was a woman with dignity, learning to see herself through different eyes. The irony was sharp. James, obsessed with appearances, had mocked both Margaret and Samuel for what they looked like. To him, Margaret was too fat, and Samuel was too small. Yet it was precisely in those two people, cast aside and ridiculed, that true strength and compassion grew. Their bond was not built on beauty or power, but on something deeper, the recognition of humanity in each other. Margaret saw Samuel not as a dwarf, not as a slave, but as a man whose spirit outshone the cruelty of their world. Samuel saw Margaret not as a mocked wife or an ornament in a planter's house, but as a woman yearning for respect. This unlikely bond did not go unnoticed forever. Whispers spread quietly across the plantation. The slaves spoke of it with hope, seeing in Margaret's newfound strength a sign that even those within the master's house could be touched by dignity. For Margaret, the bond was not about rebellion but about survival. Samuel had given her the courage to believe she was more than the sum of her husband's insults. And in return, she gave Samuel something he had rarely received in life: acknowledgement as a man, not a possession. It was a dangerous friendship, born out of cruelty but forged into resilience. And though neither Samuel nor Margaret spoke of it aloud, they both knew that James's cruel bet, the words meant to humiliate, had become the seed of something he could not control. In the shadow of one man's pride, two wounded souls found strength in each other. Their bond was unlikely, even forbidden, but it carried a truth that no whip, no insult, no chain could erase. Dignity grows where it is nurtured, and respect can bloom in the most unlikely of places. For Margaret, Samuel became a mirror that reflected her worth back to her. For Samuel, Margaret became proof that even in the Master's house, humanity could survive. And for James, though he did not yet realize it, the bond between his wife and his slave would become the very thing that shattered the illusion of his power. James Whitlock had always believed himself the unquestioned master of his world. His wealth bought him land, his land bought him slaves, and his slaves bought him the respect, or at least the fear, of his neighbors. His wife, Margaret, was simply another possession in his eyes, one more piece of property to manage. But in the months following his drunken bet, that mocked both Margaret and Samuel, the dwarf slave, James began to sense something was changing. It was not a loud rebellion nor an outright challenge. Instead, it was subtle, a shift in the air of his home, the posture of his wife, the glances exchanged among his slaves. At first, James dismissed it, but soon, he realized that the control he had always taken for granted was slipping through his fingers. The first sign was Margaret. For years, she had been the quiet, obedient wife who endured his insults with silence. She sat at the end of the table, avoided his gaze when he mocked her, and rarely voiced her opinions in company. But now, she seemed different. At supper one evening, James made a casual jab about her weight, expecting the usual nervous silence. Instead, Margaret set down her fork, looked him in the eye, and said calmly, "I would rather be heavy with kindness than hollow with cruelty." The words struck James like a slap. The servants, standing nearby, froze in shock. Margaret had never spoken back to him so directly. James tried to laugh it off, but the laughter rang hollow even to his own ears. From then on, Margaret carried herself with new confidence. She walked with her head high. She spoke with quiet authority to the servants, not as a mistress who demanded, but as a woman who respected. Even the slaves began to look at her differently, not with fear of punishment, but with something James had never commanded: genuine respect. James could not see the root of this transformation, but others could. Samuel, the dwarf slave, remained in the background, performing his tasks with his usual calm dignity. But those who paid attention noticed the way Margaret lingered near him, how her mood brightened after speaking with him, how her courage grew as their bond deepened. Samuel never openly defied James, never spoke against him, but his very presence undermined the planter's authority. He embodied something James could not crush: dignity in the face of humiliation, and that dignity had become contagious. It was not only Margaret who changed. Among the enslaved workers, whispers began to spread. They noticed how Samuel's words carried more weight now, how Margaret's kindness made the household slightly less oppressive, and how James's insults seemed to bounce off instead of burying their targets. Slaves who once cowered now exchanged hopeful glances. They began to believe that perhaps dignity could survive even here, on Whitlock's plantation. Some even said quietly that God himself had placed Samuel in their midst, as a reminder that the master was not the measure of their worth. James began to sense it. The air of fear was thinning. It unsettled him deeply. He had always believed that fear was the glue holding his world together. Without it, what was left? One evening, James invited several neighbors for cards. As usual, he bragged about his wealth and mocked his wife. But to his annoyance, Margaret no longer seemed wounded. She answered his jibes with calm grace, sometimes even witty remarks that made the guests chuckle, not at her, but at him. When the evening ended, one of his neighbors clapped him on the shoulder and said, half joking, "Whitlock, your wife's tongue is sharper than yours these days. Careful, or she'll be the master of the house." James forced a laugh, but inside, rage boiled. He had always defined himself by dominance, over his wife, over his slaves, over his peers, And now even his neighbors saw cracks in that dominance. Later that night, James confronted Margaret in her chamber. His face was red with drink and anger. "What has gotten into you?" he demanded. "You think you can speak to me like that in front of others?"
"You embarrass me!"
Margaret, standing tall, met his glare without trembling. "No, James," she said softly. "It is you who embarrasses yourself." The words hit harder than a whip. For a moment, James stood frozen. He had expected tears, apologies, begging, but instead he faced a woman who no longer bowed to him in spirit. In that instant, he realized something that shook him. He was losing control, not just of his wife, but of the very foundation of his power. The more James tried to reassert his dominance, the less effective it became. His insults no longer silenced Margaret. His scorn no longer humiliated Samuel. Even the slaves in the field seemed to work with less fear, their eyes carrying a spark that unsettled him. It was as if his cruelty, once his greatest weapon, had become a mirror reflecting his own weakness. He could not comprehend it. How could a fat wife he mocked and a dwarf slave he ridiculed become stronger than him? The realization gnawed at him. His pride, once unshakable, now felt fragile. One night, unable to sleep, James walked the halls of his house. He passed Margaret's chamber, where he heard her soft voice reading aloud. Reading to Samuel, who sat quietly in the corner. The sight froze him. His wife, who he had treated as worthless, was reading a book by candlelight to a slave he had mocked as less than a man. And in that room, James felt like the outsider. For the first time in his life, James Whitlock felt powerless in his own home. The awakening was not thunderous or sudden. It was quiet, creeping into James's soul like a slow, burning fire. He realized with horror that his wealth and cruelty could not command love, could not command respect, and could not erase the bond that had formed between those he tried to break. Margaret had found her dignity. Samuel had never lost his, and James, despite all his power, had neither. This was the shocking truth that shattered the illusion of his control. The very people he despised had become stronger than him, not through rebellion, but through the simple, unyielding power of respect and humanity. And nothing terrified James Whitlock more. The Whitlock plantation was a world built on pride, wealth, and cruelty. James Whitlock believed himself master of all he surveyed. He owned land, slaves, and a fine house, and he wielded fear like a weapon. Yet, in the end, it was not his fields or fortune that defined him. It was the lesson hidden in his downfall. That lesson would echo beyond the cotton rows, whispered among the enslaved, murmured in Margaret's heart, and remembered long after James Whitlock's name had faded. By the late months of 1834, the Whitlock household was no longer the fortress of power James imagined it to be. Though the plantation still produced cotton, and James still strutted through town as a wealthy planter, the balance inside his home had shifted. Margaret, once silent and humiliated, now walked with quiet dignity. Samuel, the dwarf slave once mocked as useless, had become a figure of respect and strength, not only to the enslaved but to Margaret herself. James remained blind to how deeply his cruel bet had reshaped the household dynamic, but he felt the effects in the air. His wife no longer feared him. His slaves no longer trembled quite the same way, and his own confidence had begun to waver. In a world built on dominance, the smallest cracks are the ones that spread fastest. Among the enslaved, the story began to take on the shape of legend. They whispered of the mistress who found courage through the dignity of a dwarf. They spoke of Samuel's calm defiance, how he held his head high even when mocked, how he gave words of strength when others despaired. The tale became more than gossip, it became a symbol. To the men and women bent under the Alabama sun, it proved that cruelty could be endured, that dignity could survive, and that even the proud master was not untouchable. For many, it was the first time they saw hope not in escape or rebellion, but in the quiet endurance of dignity. Margaret, for her part, never spoke openly against her husband. She knew the danger of doing so in a world where a wife had few rights. But in her actions, she lived her quiet defiance. She began treating the enslaved with compassion, offering them small kindnesses that James would have scorned as weakness. She refused to crumble under her husband's insults, answering him with calm, measured words that cut deeper than any shouting could. and she clung to Samuel's wisdom, letting his steady presence remind her that respect and love were stronger than wealth and cruelty. Through Margaret, the lesson of Samuel's dignity was amplified. A woman once silenced had found her voice, and her transformation proved that no amount of humiliation could destroy a soul determined to rise. James never admitted defeat. To the outside world, he remained the wealthy planter, the man with fine horses and a large house. But those closest to him saw a man crumbling. His wife no longer sought his approval. His slaves no longer quaked at his footsteps the way they once had, and Samuel, small, mocked, dismissed, remained unbroken. For James, the true shock was realizing that fear could only carry him so far. He had built his empire on domination, but he had never earned the one thing he craved most: respect. His pride had blinded him, and in the end, it left him hollow. The lesson of the Whitlock household was simple yet profound: power built on cruelty cannot last. Samuel, a dwarf slave, taught it without ever raising a hand. His lesson was not in rebellion, but in resilience. He showed that dignity cannot be bought or beaten out of a man. Even in chains, he carried himself as free in spirit. Margaret, a woman mocked for her weight and silenced by her husband, learned that her worth was not defined by cruelty. Her bond with Samuel reminded her that love and respect matter more than appearances, and that strength can be found in the most unlikely of places. Together, they proved that respect is a stronger foundation than fear, and dignity outlasts domination. Long after the Whitlock plantation fell silent, after the cotton rows were abandoned, after the house fell into disrepair, the story lived on. Enslaved families who later found freedom passed it down: the tale of a cruel master, a humiliated wife, and a dwarf slave whose spirit could not be broken. To some, it was a parable of pride and downfall. To others, it was a story of courage, proving that strength does not always roar. It sometimes whispers through patience and dignity. And to Margaret, who carried the lesson in her heart until her final days, it was a reminder that even in the darkest corners of cruelty, humanity could still be found. What happened in Alabama was not recorded in books, nor praised in newspapers. It was too small a story for the world of history, yet too large a truth to be forgotten by those who lived it. James Whitlock thought himself powerful, yet he died never knowing true respect. Margaret thought herself broken, yet she discovered her voice, and Samuel, thought of as less than a man, revealed the true measure of manhood through dignity, courage, and kindness. The lesson that echoed was this: cruelty may command obedience, but only respect commands hearts. Wealth may build houses, but only dignity builds legacies. And sometimes, the smallest among us, the mocked, the marginalized, the dismissed, carry the greatest strength of all.